As far as I can remember, every Christmas Eve, my parents gave us sleeping pills. I don't remember much, but they said something about not being awake when Santa Claus arrived. We had a schedule that the whole family had to follow. We had dinner at 5, at 6 we put on matching pajamas, watched that very bad movie called It's a Wonderful Life, and then at 8:30 we all used the last bit of eggnog to swallow those pills. They were quite strong. My sister fell asleep after about 15 minutes while I took a bit longer to fall asleep, but usually I was asleep by 9 o'clock. So, the next morning we would wake up groggy but fine, and my mother would tell us that Santa Claus left us presents under the Christmas tree because we had been good kids, but it was all nonsense. Throughout my life, I thought this was exactly what everyone did on Christmas Eve. You had to be asleep when Santa Claus arrived, otherwise Santa's magic wouldn't work. So, we took magical pills to make sure we'd be asleep. As a kid, it all made sense to me. You don't question what's at stake when it comes to receiving gifts. Your parents are the law and you don't question them. I only started to think it was weird when I got to high school. At that age, you no longer believe in Santa Claus, or at least you shouldn't. At that point, some beliefs are ridiculed, and from then on, we started talking about things like video games and brand name sneakers. But I had only one question when the subject of Christmas came up. When did you stop taking the magic pills? That's a question that falls under the Family Matters clause, and I immediately regretted asking it. On the day I asked that question to my friends, they all laughed at me while I sat there, red as a pepper, trying to turn it into a joke. That was the day I found out the magic pills weren't normal. Last year, I got tired of the lies my parents told me. I was tired of matching pajamas, tired of pretending we were having the perfect family Christmas. I wanted to know why my parents gave us drugs to sleep. I had to know why. So, when Christmas came, the moment my mother handed me that little white pill, I hid it under my tongue and spat it into the toilet, then went to bed and pretended to be asleep. I waited until I could hear my mother snoring so I could get up and look around. I wasn't surprised to see the tree already filled with presents, but that was it. I wasn't discovering any secret, nothing unusual or strange until I saw something unusual. I was reading the credit card statement with my head down when suddenly I saw movement outside the house. We always have a snowy Christmas, and at that time, the street was completely silent. That's when I saw something pass by the window of the house and I was startled by the movement. I almost opened the front door to take a look when I saw them. There were many of them landing on the roofs one by one and crawling through the chimneys of all the houses. I don't even know how to describe them correctly. Maybe I went through post-traumatic stress disorder. Quickly, I crouched down on the nearest couch, hid behind the curtains, and watched those giant things like red spiders as they slid across the rooftops. They reached the chimneys of the houses and one by one, they jumped inside. Shortly afterward, they would disappear for a few minutes, then reappear. Most of them wouldn't come out with anything, but sometimes they'd emerge with random items or decorations. For a brief, unhappy second, I thought they might be some macabre version of Santa Claus elves until I heard a horrible sound. The sound that still haunts all my days. Agonizing screams of pure terror, despair, sounds resembling grinding, and alongside all that, the sound of someone's body being forced up the chimney. Still hidden behind the sofa, I watched in horror as Maggie, the Smith's daughter, was pulled up the chimney by two of those aberrations. The moment they pulled her out, she stopped screaming. I don't believe she was still alive. I hope not. Her body wasn't normal. To give you an idea, it was as if a tube of toothpaste had burst. I sat there in shock, watching the Smith's roof turn pink from the snow and Maggie's blood. Not knowing how to get out of that situation, I remembered that my parents gave us those sleeping pills. So, I ran straight to the bathroom and took 3 of those small white sleeping pills, lay in my bed, pulled the covers over my head, and started to chew the medication. Have you ever tried chewing pills? They have a horrible taste that can't be described. I almost vomited twice during the process. And to make matters worse, I started hearing those things getting closer to my house. Do you know that story about Santa Claus and his reindeer? About the bells and the animals' hooves? Well, there are no reindeers, just these aberrations. That terrifying clicking of the bells comes from them, and I knew what they did to people who didn't sleep. Waking up the next day was strange. Everyone woke up in the morning, and I woke up to my father shaking me to wake up after noon. I could tell he wasn't impressed, but I was in shock, screaming because I knew what was happening to me. After I stopped screaming, it took me a few seconds to realize that I wasn't being dragged up the chimney, but when I did, I was in ecstasy. I hugged my dad as if we were in a wrestling match, ran and went downstairs to hug my mom harder than I had in years, then I threw my sister over my shoulder and started playing with her. She was 8 at the time, still 100% believing in the whole Santa Claus story. Happiness was contagious, and for the first time in a long time, I was emotional about spending Christmas with my family. After that, we opened our Christmas stockings, exchanged gifts, and were feasting on fresh cinnamon rolls and eggs Benedict until I made the mistake of looking outside. By then, I kind of convinced myself that I had just had a crazy dream. I had gone out the night before to smoke with one of my friends on Christmas Eve, so I figured maybe I suffered some side effects from mixing weed with sleeping medicine. But the moment I looked outside, my eyes were drawn to the Smith's house and that pink stain on top of the residence. Suddenly, I couldn't eat anything else and had to drink a whole glass of milk just to try to swallow the food. It hadn't been a dream. So where were the cops? Sure, I woke up late, but if a child goes missing on Christmas Eve, you'd assume the police would be crawling all over the neighborhood all day. I was looking out the window, feeling my stomach getting heavier until my dad brought me back to reality. I looked at him and nodded when he asked me if I was feeling okay. Right after that, I asked, "Hey, have you seen the Smiths?" And I wondered if maybe they just didn't want to spoil the mood. I observed my parents and they exchanged a penetrating, yet quick glance before he shook his head and smiled at me. My dad replied, "Not yet. I'll let you know if I see Maggie out there," grabbing my shoulder and giving it a squeeze as he left the table. Mom gave me a gentle smile and poured me another glass of milk. I sat there for about another hour before finally giving up and going to help my sister set up her new dollhouse. When winter break ended, I was back at school expecting a commotion that never happened. In freshman year, when a kid had a car accident, the entire faculty held a vigil for him. There was a memorial in the auditorium after school meetings to light candles, and the school even brought in some therapists to talk to students and teachers. No one said or did anything similar for Maggie. It was as if everyone had forgotten she existed. Even the local newspaper seemed to ignore her, and they had absolutely nothing to report on most days. It wasn't until mid-January that I saw a small obituary tucked away in the corner of the last page of the newspaper. I saved it by putting it in a notebook at home. It seemed that if I didn't remember she had died, no one else would. Honestly, this whole situation took a toll on me. March came and went, and so did my birthday. I was 17 now and should have been focusing on college planning, but all I could think about was the past Christmas. I could hardly sleep. Every night, I'd go to bed and lie there staring at the ceiling, jumping at every little creak of the bed. Every morning, I woke up with darker circles under my eyes than the day before. I couldn't concentrate on school anymore, my grades started dropping, and my parents began asking if it had something to do with drugs. By the end of October, I had made 8 visits to the school counselor, and they were gently asking if things were okay at home. What could I say? "No, Mrs. Andrews, I saw Christmas spiders pulling a girl out of a chimney." I couldn't tell anyone. How do you talk about something like that to someone? I sounded like a lunatic. I even asked my friends if I was high on Christmas Eve. I'd definitely get locked up in a loony bin if I spoke about giant red spiders attacking people on Christmas night. But I was losing my mind. We had Thanksgiving and Halloween was coming up. The colder the weather got, the more anxious I became. Stores were already releasing costumes and lanterns to make room for Christmas decorations. The first signs of Christmas were appearing and I was getting terrified. That's when my friends called me to hang out. It might sound stupid, but my friends and I have a code we use when things are bad and we need to talk. We had definitively split up in high school, none of us hung out together anymore, but none of us ever gave up on the other when someone said they needed a hit. I was exhausted from it all, but when the bat signal goes off, you have to answer. "Roll it right or don't roll at all, dude," Sophia complained, watching Greg grimace as he tried to roll a joint. We were huddled in the forest behind the school, freezing in the morning's cold wave. Max took a deep drag and then exhaled the smoke with a sigh before passing the joint around. "Hey, it's been quite a year, huh?" Max was always the speechmaker. I sat there, shaking and waiting for my turn with the joint. "We haven't had much time to hang out. Even though I'm busy, you guys are still my best friends. Even one day, when I'm off to Hollywood and become famous, I'll always love you all," Max said as we chuckled at what he said. So, like, this was out of love that we gathered. I think we all know why we're here. "Hayden." He paused as Sophia finally passed the joint to me. "This is like an intervention." I couldn't even smoke before choking and coughing in surprise. "We're really worried about you," Sophia gently added, placing her hand on my arm. "You don't have to worry," I mumbled, taking a drag. "I got fired from my job, so my car wasn't insured. I got a ride there with Max, and if I wanted to leave right then, I'd have to walk back home, but it was too cold for that." Max tried to get me to open up, saying, "Come on, talk to us, man, you just vanished, we never see you anymore." We were worried. "Don't," I said. "Max told me people think you're gonna shoot up the school." Oh my God, I thought we agreed not to tell him that. Sophia said, covering her face while Greg just shrugged. Someone had to say it, Max added. You guys suck. I stood up to leave. I was already stressed and sleep deprived. Now I was also embarrassed about what was going on. People started thinking I was going to start a school shooting? My friends thought that? I didn't even kill bugs. Wait up. Just wait a second. Max said, grabbing my arm and pulling me back, handing me the joint. Just relax, okay? Come on, we're your friends. When Sophia's parents divorced, what did we do? We smoked and talked. When Greg's dog died, we smoked and talked. You're not the Hayden we know, so talk to us, please. I sat on the nearest tree stump, mustering the courage to tell them the truth. After all, what did I have to lose? They already thought I was crazy anyway. Do you guys remember in high school when I talked about the Christmas magic pills? The Santa pills? They asked, squinting at me. Yeah, I guess. What about them? They weren't magic pills, they were sleeping pills. As far back as I can remember, my parents drugged my sister and me on Christmas Eve. I thought it was normal, thought every family did it. They told me they were magic pills to make sure we were all asleep so that Santa. I paused for a few seconds, groaning and rubbing my face, trying not to get angry at what they did to us, and continued. So that Santa would come. Because he doesn't come when you're awake. I saw Greg cover his mouth with his hand while his shoulders shook. Sophia looked angrily at him and gave him a strong elbow in the arm. When I saw that situation, I gave up on continuing and said, Forget it, this is nonsense. No, it's not. Keep going, come on, we want to hear. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I hated closing my eyes. If I closed my eyes and thought about it again, I could see everything happening again in my mind. I could hear Maggie's screams again. Last year, I didn't swallow my pill because I wanted to see what happened after we fell asleep, and I wanted to see what they were hiding. That's when I saw those things. They climb on the roofs, come down the chimneys of houses, and take those who aren't sleeping. Do you remember Maggie? That's how she died. I saw them take her and I heard her screams. And that's all I can think about. I didn't realize it at the moment, but by the end of the story, I was crying. A dam had burst somewhere inside me. I wiped my tears with my shirt sleeve and I could see that Greg had stopped laughing, but I couldn't look at any of their faces. I was still too embarrassed. I sounded insane. All I could do was examine the bucket we had turned upside down to use as a table. It was old, worn, and cracked. They never found her body, Max said, his voice tense. I know Maggie's brother. Like, not too well, but we talk now and then. He said they were all asleep. No one heard anything. They never found the body, and because of that, they moved last summer. Indignant at what I heard, I said, What? How did I miss that? I spent much more time than I should have looking at their house. I would have noticed if they had moved. Max replied, Yeah, it was around August. He texted me, said they were moving, and that's it. We all stood there in silence, shocked for a while until Sophia said, So, how do you know your parents drugged you? She asked, her eyes tense. Like, those magic pills could have been candies or something, and all this you're going through might just be a placebo effect. I replied promptly, I saw the prescription bottle, plus you feel weird the next day. Sophia asked, Weird how? Dizzy? We all looked at Greg. He was silent but seemed nervous now, passing the joint without taking a drag. You wake up groggy. You know when you wake up in the middle of the night? It's like that, but it's morning. And you just slept through the night. I never woke up on Christmas Eve. Never. The more I talked, the more alarmed Greg and Sophia seemed. Do your parents drug you too? I asked the pair. No. Sophia exclaimed, seeming offended. No, I don't think so. Grandma brews us a tea every Christmas Eve. It was supposed to calm us and then we'd sleep well. Describing this, she scrunched up her face and pulled her hair back. Damn, they're drugging us too. Greg looked completely confused. He didn't say it, but from the expression on his face, he also slept very well on Christmas Eve. I take a lot of Zolpidem, Max said, shrugging. By this point, Sophia was pacing back and forth, saying, Okay, so they're drugging us. But why? Look, I believe you saw these things, but could it have been some kind of hallucination? Why isn't the world talking about it? You mean the news about Maggie's disappearance? I asked. I live across the street and the police didn't even show up. No one cared about Maggie's death. No one talked about it. No wonder they moved. We all just pretended she didn't exist. The shameful silence lingered until Greg's phone rang and he said he had to go to work. So Sophia left too, as they both worked at the same diner. They bid us a lackluster goodbye. I was exhausted, emotionally drained after telling all that. Max offered to drive me home after the others left. From the trees behind the school to my house, not a word was said. He seemed lost in thought, and I was so tired I didn't even want to try to talk. It didn't matter anymore. I had told them. They could think I was crazy all they wanted. When I got home, I found money on the kitchen counter and I placed an order from Domino's before finding something to watch. The whole time I sat there, all I could think about was Maggie and how she had vanished from our small town the moment she was abducted. It was as if these things had erased her from the map and everyone let it happen. I remembered the obituary I grabbed from the newspaper during dinner and rushed upstairs to fetch the notebook where I had stored it. It didn't take me long to find it. Like all obituaries, they had noted the date of her death, and that gave me a brilliant idea. I started researching the incident. Our town was small and rural, but we had a local newspaper, and a few years ago they secured a government grant to start a website and digitize everything. That meant they had obituaries from decades ago for me to examine. I began searching for any deaths around Christmas. Deaths in December weren't uncommon, even in a small town. The reasons could vary from icy roads causing a fatal slip for an elderly lady to depression claiming a life. Anyway, death was anticipated around Christmas. But as I started analyzing the obituaries, I noticed they were all short with few details and all were published weeks after the Christmas event. There were never any funerals or memorial services. There were no options to send flowers anywhere. It seemed that every year, at least one person died under strange circumstances on Christmas and they simply vanished. I made a list of the recent deaths and began searching for their families. Like the Smiths, most families moved after the loved one's death. I scoured social media pages for more clues, but those who had moved away didn't maintain ties with anyone from our small town. In fact, many of the families hadn't been in town long before the deaths occurred. Like the Smiths, they only moved here a few months before last Christmas. It wasn't uncommon for families to move here for oil opportunities, make some money, and leave when they realized there wasn't much to do. I sat there while eating the last few slices of pizza that were already cold. Why hadn't I researched this before? I spent most of my year trying to forget what I had seen, but out of sheer fear, I let it all slide. All I could think about was Christmas and what I knew would happen when I was asleep. I almost failed school because I couldn't focus in class. I lost my job. The job wasn't great, but at least I had one. I was close to losing any chance at a decent college. But worse than that, I was probably the only person who had seen what happens on Christmas Eve and lived to talk about it. That gave me a responsibility, right? I knew what they were like and what they did, and now I knew it had been happening for years. My parents had been giving me this drug since I was born, so they must know. They grew up here. They must know what happens during the night. The Smiths had been in town for only a few months. Maybe nobody warned them. Maybe they just went to bed normally without knowing the risks. But why didn't anyone tell them? I grabbed my phone and messaged Max. I needed him to bridge a connection with Maggie's brother. I needed to know what happened after she died. So I messaged everyone on my Facebook in a large group chat since there were some families that had been living here for generations. I had the perfect idea of how to reach out to them. Trying to speak to Maggie's brother was somewhat a waste of time. I wasn't completely knocked down, but I was disappointed. I thought he would really talk to me at first. It was all going so well, even after mentioning how crazy it was that nobody talked about his sister's death, but suddenly he stopped responding and blocked me. He blocked me on Instagram, Facebook, and when I tried calling his cell, I got that annoying robot voice saying the number was out of service. After being blocked, I told my friends about my new plan. To dig deeper into the story, we needed to go door to door asking about what happened on Christmas in that town, and nothing better than using Halloween to our advantage. It wasn't exactly a popular request, but everyone seemed to agree out of sheer loyalty. However, typically when you're 17, you either go to a school or college party and get drunk because, let's face it, people don't like giving candy to teenagers. But this year, we were hitting the streets. Someone's going to call the cops on us. My dad's going to kill me if he finds out. Greg seemed as paranoid as ever. I couldn't blame him. His parents were super religious and thought costumes were some kind of underworld ritual. We had to stash a black cloak and plastic sharp teeth for him at Max's house where we all got ready. Each of us went for something quick and easy. Greg was a vampire, Sophia was a witch, Max put on a cowboy hat, and I dressed up as a ghost. They weren't great costumes, but they were costumes. How did you convince your parents to let you out tonight? I asked Greg. He lifted a plastic bag full of religious pamphlets and said, I told them I was called to spread our religion. So, what's the plan? We hit up a few houses, asked for some candy to seem legit, and then head to the houses on my list, I replied, pulling out a list and a map where I had marked all the locations. And are you just going to ask them about the family member who was murdered? What if they're kids? Greg asked me. I'm thinking of showing them this. I grabbed a piece of paper with a drawing of one of the creatures I saw. They all looked at the drawing I made and were startled. Don't spiders have 8 legs? It's only got 4, Sophia remarked. I rolled my eyes and put it back in my bag. I said they're creatures that look like spiders, but they're not real spiders. Okay, Picasso. Sophia laughed as we ventured into the night. We got turned away at some houses, but people were generous most of the time. We received some comments like, glad to see teenagers doing something healthy. It was fun. Trick-or-treating with my friends brought back many good memories and feelings. Every time we stopped to check our route, it felt like we were kids again. It gave me a glimpse of hope about my life before we hit the first target house. When we reached the first desired house, we had to wait for a large group of kids to get their candies from the residents so that we could go there and ring the bell. As soon as they left, we went to the house and shouted, "Trick or treat." The door opened and a woman stepped out. A lady who looked about 50 returned an awkward smile and grabbed her bowl of candies to hand them to us. I immediately raised my drawing and asked, "Do you recognize this?" She paused, looked at my drawing, then shook her head. "No, I don't. But it's very cool. Have a nice Halloween." We didn't even have time to react as the next group of kids was already pushing us off the porch. Okay, that didn't work. I sighed, opening a small bag of chips. Why should we believe her? Sophia asked, doing the same. We all started walking and eating the chips. Yeah, I don't think she saw them. She didn't even flinch, Greg said. So maybe you need to try harder next time. If no one saw these things, it won't mean anything to them. Ask them about the deaths, Sophia suggested. So that's what I did. The next target house was polite with us, considering the questions we asked them. The following house slammed the door in our faces. After that, the subsequent house took back the candies after we asked a few questions before knocking. Honestly, we were doing pretty poorly. It was getting late and we agreed to go to Max's house at his parents' curfew and hang out there to watch a movie. I had mapped out a plan for only 10 houses and we were reaching our limit. The last house was a dead end. No pumpkins, lights, or anything that related to the holiday. One last idea came to my mind and I asked, does anyone have a pen? Greg rummaged through his bag of pamphlets and handed me one, and I crouched on the sidewalk to make some notes on the back of the drawing paper. I left my phone number with an explanation and placed it in the old rusty mailbox at the house's door. I almost tore my fingers trying to slip the paper, but I managed. As soon as I saw it disappear into the slot, we began to leave the place. We were almost a house away when we started hearing a hoarse shout coming from the house. We looked back, and a woman who must have been at least 80 was waving at us. "Come here," she yelled, clutching the paper in her hand. We all froze and exchanged looks, shocked by what we were seeing. I think a part of me really didn't believe anyone would recognize it. If no one recognized it, the issue would be up for debate. I could say I did what I could and just start therapy to deal with what I saw last Christmas. But instead, we all turned back to the house and approached the woman on the porch. "Come in, it's cold out there," she said, stepping aside and gesturing for us to enter the house. What seemed like no lights on from the outside were actually the thickest blackout curtains I've ever seen in my life. All the windows we could see were completely covered with curtains and iron bars. When the lady closed the door, she locked it and propped a chair against the lock. Not that I thought it was really necessary, as the front door looked like an industrial security door seen from the inside. But what really caught my attention and what I couldn't stop staring at was the fireplace in the house. The woman simply filled the bottom of the fireplace with cement and wrapped it with barbed wire. As we took some seats to sit, the woman turned to us and said, "So, it seems like you were awake on Christmas Eve. Must have been a big scare, huh? When did it happen?" I was in shock. She was comfortably seated in an armchair right in front of us with a shotgun stuck in what seemed to be a magazine holder. "Well, last year," I stammered. She nodded as she carefully examined the drawing. I continued, "I needed to know why they give us pills." "Pills? Nowadays they're too nice. In my day, you got an infusion of some herbs or your dad made you drink a bit of alcohol. They'll do anything to cover it all up. I guess your parents follow the line of thinking that says, never lie to your kids." She tucked the piece of paper into her pocket and said, pointing at my friends, "See where that got them? Do they know what happened?" I quickly nodded in response to her question. "Well, you're lucky. Not many people see the creatures and live to talk about it. Almost everyone who does dies in the process. They come down the chimney." I whispered and the lady's face softened. "Poor boy. You must live near the girl who died. There was only one case last year, I hope." "I'm sorry, dear, that's something no one should see." Beside me, Greg, Max, and Sophia were all sunk into themselves, unable to believe what they were hearing. Sophia seemed like she was about to vomit at any moment. "So, it's real?" she asked. The woman nodded solemnly. She gave us a smile with her thin lips before standing up and going inside the house. Not long after, the lady returned with a box in her hands. "You probably already know this, but my name is Rosalie Walsh, but you can call me Rosie. My family has lived here for generations. My sister, God rest her soul, was the last member of my family to die in that horrible way. She was taking a new medication for her psychological issues. We didn't know they were amphetamines. Over time, she realized she couldn't sleep anymore and there was simply nothing we could do about it. She told me about it in a letter she left for me. There's an empty grave with a headstone bearing her name in the cemetery. There are many graves and empty urns there. Many families in this town never managed to bury their loved ones." After that, the woman rummaged through the box she had brought and pulled out a family photo album. There were several photos with red dots next to them, and I realized they were people who had been taken by the creatures. Soon after, I asked, "So you never find the bodies?" "No, and having seen this happen, I think it's both a blessing and a curse," the woman replied. "But where do the bodies go?" Max asked, flipping through the album while frowning at the growing list of red dots. "I don't know. There are many rumors and stories about it. Some people say they're eaten by the creatures. The bathroom is at the end of the hallway to the left," she pointed out to Greg, who was already turning green after hearing all this. Grateful, Greg rushed into the house. Then the lady continued, "As I said, some people believe they're eaten. Others believe they were taken somewhere. Others believe the creatures are some kind of more animalistic fairies and that people are taken to some kind of fantasy land and that everyone who is taken is all up there living in an alternate paradise. I think if they saw the appearance of a person after going up a chimney, there would be no positive thought left." Still a bit confused, I asked, "So what are they?" She sighed and adjusted herself in the chair. "Look at this here," she said as she handed me the box. "I'm not a specialist, not a historian or an archaeologist. I went to accounting school, but I was your age when I started getting interested in this. The reason I wanted to know more about this whole story was because one day I woke up at the wrong time that night. I guess my father didn't put enough whiskey in my drink that night. Instead of waking up on Christmas morning, I woke up near midnight. I heard hooves on the roof of the house. I could swear I heard the reindeer bells. No matter how old you are, if you think you heard Santa on Christmas Eve, you're going to get up to look. So I did. I went very slowly and quietly. I got to the edge of the room when I saw those disgusting creatures. They took my younger brother and then..." She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and resting her fingers on her face, and continued with a choked voice. "My God, 60 years later and it still gets me. They put him in the chimney. A pair of creatures climbed to the top of the house. One held his head and the other held his legs from inside the house. He was awake. He screamed and he screamed a lot. As she told the story, she waved her hand a bit as if trying to push the memory from her mind. I couldn't do anything. I was too scared. I went back to bed and hid under the covers. But it was going to be fine. As soon as they get a clock, they leave. They got what they wanted and I went years without sleeping. In short, I still don't know what they actually are." While she spoke, Sophia and I rummaged through the box the lady had given us. There were dates, times, letters written by strangers describing what they had seen. There were many drawings too, much better than mine, but all showing similar beings. "What's this?" I asked, holding a photo of a roof. It looked like someone was going to take a picture of something, but couldn't. All I could see was a snow-covered roof and some strange white blotches. Looking at the photo and settling back into her chair, the woman replied, "That's how they appear on camera. The only reason we know what they look like is from eyewitness accounts. Even on video, they can't be seen. They come out like that, looking like a glittery spot." The lady let out a deep sigh and looked up at the ceiling. Her face seemed thinner and more worn than when we first saw her. "They always come in groups of 3. I've never seen a house without a trio. They always come down the chimney. They take the first clock they find. 1 clock per house. Then they move on to the next residence and so on. Can't we just close the chimneys?" Max asked, pointing to the fireplace covered with cement she had made. "That won't solve everything." "And the apartments? Have you ever seen an apartment in this town, kid?" the woman asked, looking at Max. We all paused for a moment to think. There's a regulation here in town. This town has strict rules about what can be built or not. There are no apartments here. Most of what you see is a duplex and they all have a fireplace. She was right. There were no apartments anywhere within the city limits. Even the 2-story houses were modified to have a chimney. If someone built something different from the norm, you could bet the neighbors would talk about it. In a way, a single-story house stood out too much for the population. She kept saying, "Each family deals with it differently." My parents told us after my brother disappeared. I felt it wasn't fair to know all this after it had already happened. Some people don't tell their children until it's time for them to move away. I guess they want to shield us from knowing all the terror that happens. Not everyone copes well with it when they find out the truth. My eldest son named John didn't believe us and said we made up the story to keep him at home. But even so, it was a very tough Christmas that year. My husband and I asked the kids to help us clean the roof after what happened. And do you think they believed us after that? Of course. But thanks to that, everyone is still alive. At some point, Greg returned from the bathroom and we sat in a stunned silence as Rosie recounted all that. After telling us all she knew, the memories seemed to start affecting her well-being. "Time's up, kids. Halloween is over," she said, taking the box back. "The best I can suggest is for you to take these pills. Take enough to sleep until the next day and try to pretend you don't know about this." We all stood there, as bewildered as deer caught in the headlights of cars. "Take this, one last gift. I don't know what they are, but I know they're not divine beings," the lady said, tucking a thick notebook into the pillowcase I was using to collect the candies I received. She patted my shoulder, then gently nudged us out of the house. We barely made it in time for Max's parents' curfew that night. Not that it mattered much. Max's parents were pretty laid back and his older sister was still partying when we got home. At some point, someone suggested ordering pizza and watching a movie. We ended up choosing to watch The Little Mermaid. Laugh all you want, but in the situation we were in, it was the only thing we could agree to watch. None of us wanted to watch anything involving horror after hearing what Rosie told us. After that, we didn't talk for a few weeks. It was as if all of us, without saying a word to each other, mutually agreed that we couldn't be around each other after learning the truth about our little town's Christmas. I couldn't even bring myself to open the book Rosie gave me. I hid it under my bed, gave my candies to my sister, and put an end to all my research. I didn't want to think about it anymore. And for the first time since last Christmas, I managed to sleep soundly. Until a few weeks ago when Sophia called me. As soon as I picked up the call, Sophia told me that someone had moved to town in early December, a family of 5. The father, mother, and 3 kids. They lived a few houses down from her place and she watched them like a hawk eyeing its prey. She wanted to see what the neighbors would do. Normally, the older folks would welcome new neighbors, show up with some sort of gift basket, and along with the basket, they'd bring a cheap plastic key to the city. But there was no movement to greet these newcomers. "I think they're using them as the sacrifice for Christmas Eve," Sophia said after we all gathered at that spot behind the school where we usually went to smoke. "That's why the police don't show up, that's why the newspapers don't publish any news related to it, and that's also why no one talks about our town after they leave. If everyone who's lived here their whole life knows that you have to keep sleeping on Christmas Eve, there won't be anyone for the creatures to take. So they need new people to come to town. They need people for the spiders to take."